This week on Christian World News, bringing aid and comfort to a war zone as refugees flee their homes in northeast Syria. This compassionate team of relief workers is going in to help them. Plus, democracy protesters in Hong Kong get a huge show of support from half a world away. How is China reacting? And the Christian leaders who see God's hand at work there. And God's hostage Andrew Brunson spent 2 years in a Turkish prison. Now he's talking about the prayer movement that set him free and how it's sparking revival in the Muslim world. Welcome to Christian World News. I'm Gary Lane. The Turkish invasion of northern Syria created a humanitarian crisis. Syrians, Kurds, Christians, and Yazidis are all fleeing for their lives. Brave relief workers are facing the danger there to bring them help. CWN co-host George Thomas went with a team that's partnering with CBN's Operation Blessing to bring relief to thousands of families in northern Syria.
This was the scene in Ras Al Ain Wednesday as Turkish-backed jihadists made a new push to take control of the strategic town.
I'm so old I don't even remember how long I've lived there. Maybe 30, maybe 40 years. I cannot believe what's happening in my hometown.
Some 300,000 Syrian Kurds have been on the move since Turkey's invasion last Wednesday, most escaping with little more than the clothes on their back.
People in Syria are suffering a lot because the Americans sold us for £0.50 and the Russians sold us as well. Why must the Kurds always be subject to genocide?
CBN's Operation Blessing is partnering with Kurdish relief agency Barzani Charity Foundation to help thousands of families with essential supplies.
Since yesterday, we have distributed 5,000 food parcels, 20,000 blankets, 5,000 hygiene kits, hundreds of thousands liters of water, and baby formula with baby diapers.
Within hours of Turkey's invasion, Barzani Charity Foundation initially thought about setting up 2 positions right on the Syrian-Iraqi border, thinking that all of these Syrian Kurds would come to the center looking for help. They didn't. So instead, they decided to come right into the conflict zone and right here into Syria. In Hasaka, close to the conflict zone, all of the city's 40 schools are now shelters for those escaping the fighting. This week, Operation Blessing and Barzani Charity Foundation took urgent supplies to several of the schools.
While the majority of the international NGOs have left, you came bringing your aid, and that gives me hope that there are people who still care for us.
30 semi-trucks filled with critical supplies made the dangerous journey close to northeast Syria's front lines, delivering much-needed relief and hope. Despite the risks, Barzani Charity Foundation says it will be the first of many such trips to the region.
George is fresh out of Syria. He's now in Erbil in northern Iraq. He joins us. George, tell us, what is it like for the people in the middle of the fighting right now?
I mean, it's horrific. You know, I mean, these folks, the estimates are close to about 300,000 people they're on the move. They're fleeing the northeastern part of Syria in the last week. It's terrible. I mean, I met a gentleman who said that his home was destroyed in a Turkish missile attack. There's been fierce fighting in 2-3 key strategic towns along the Turkish-Syrian border that the Turks want possession of. They want complete control. But it's so difficult because, keep in mind, Gary, this is a part of Syria that is home to Kurds, Arabs, Christians, Yazidis, as you mentioned, and they have all lived in harmony where there's freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and there's peace. And suddenly the entire region has been turned. This part of northeast Syria has been turned upside down, and men, women, and children are they're running for their lives, Gary.
And George, you know that many of our viewers are concerned for the Christians there, many Assyrian churches in that area. What can you tell us about them? How are they doing?
Yeah, I was just yesterday, less than 24 hours ago, I was in the town of Kamishli, which is probably about less than 25 miles from the conflict zone, and we were passing through the town and a mortar shell landed. This is also a community. Unfortunately, it did not explode, but there's a large Christian population. During the ISIS onslaught, almost 50-60% of the Christian population left. They never came back. The remaining are now leaving. It's not just in Kamishli, it's across this part. Again, you have to keep in mind, since 2012, this place, the Kurds have managed to create a semblance of peace and harmony, where all of these various faith groups could live in peace and in harmony. And there's religious freedom. There's the freedom to worship, the freedom not to worship. You won't get killed for becoming a Christian if you leave Islam. And suddenly all of this is turned upside down because the Turks want to remove all presence of Kurds and other ethnic minorities from the community, including Christians.
And George, you were with some relief teams. They're bringing in aid. What's the reaction of the people when they see that people actually care about them?
Yeah, in fact, one woman said to the Barzani Charity Foundation, all the international aid agencies are pulling out because they're afraid of what's happening. And here you are brothers and sisters from neighboring Iraqi Kurdistan, and they're coming in the middle of this conflict zone, and it just reminds them that somebody cares for them. They were so thrilled that Operation Blessing was part of the coordinated effort by the Barzani Charity Foundation, that in the midst of turmoil, in the midst of war, brothers and sisters from the region, from around the world are coming and lending a hand in the midst of their challenges with basic needs. I mean, we're talking basic needs. When you leave your home, all you have is the clothes on your back. You maybe carry a suitcase and important documents, but that's it. No memories, no pictures, no memorabilia, none of that, because you're just running in many cases. And so to have these relief agencies come and help at such a time is a tremendous blessing and gives hope to the community.
Yes, a major humanitarian crisis there, George. How should we pray then for this situation?
Well, that there's a true ceasefire, and that the United States, many folks that I've spoken to, especially the Syrian Kurds, say they feel so abandoned. They just cannot believe. They're in total shock, realizing that 11,000 to 15,000 Syrian Kurds lost their lives in the battle against ISIS. They were the foot soldiers for the United States here on the ground. To realize that once again they have been abandoned. There's a Kurdish saying that I know, Gary, you are very well aware of, that the only friends that the Kurds have are the mountains that surround this part of the region. And once again, they do feel betrayed. They feel like when the greater powers are done with their interests, they drop them like a bad habit. And unfortunately, I can tell you, and you know this, there are going to be implications, ramifications for the actions the United States has carried out here in this part of northeast Syria.
And there have been for many years there, and we'll be praying, George, as I know you will, for the people, the Kurds, the Assyrians, others in that area, Yazidis too. So, George Thomas, our senior international correspondent, stay safe. Thank you for your insights.
You're welcome, Gary. Thanks.
Well, coming up, a show of support. Hong Kong's democracy movement gets a big boost. Why Christians say God is at work during this dangerous time. Christians around the world are calling on Malaysia's government to explain the disappearance of a church leader missing for more than 2 years. Pastor Raymond Koh had been threatened for his Christian activities in that Muslim nation. Malaysia's Human Rights Commission says Pastor Raymond Koh was taken into custody by the special branch of police. The Voice of the Martyrs says this security video shows 3 black SUVs surrounding Koh's vehicle on the day that he disappeared. The car is forced to a stop, and a team surrounds the car before they all drive away. Pastor Koh's family doesn't know if he's still alive. BYM launched a petition drive to press Malaysia's government for an explanation. Find out how you can sign the petition at our website at cbnnews.com. Well, Christians were forcibly removed from their government-approved church in China just minutes before it was demolished. The religious liberty magazine Bitter Winter reports that China's communist government suddenly marked it as illegal. It reports more than 1,000 security officers carried out the raid on the True Jesus Church in the Henan province. 2 elderly church members were injured in that raid. They had been taken to the hospital. Well, pro-democracy protesters got a big boost this week when the U.S. House of Representatives passed 3 bills supporting their movement, despite warnings from China. CBN's Asia correspondent Lucille Toulousan reports that these congressional actions are giving Hong Kong protesters hope.
It's police tactics like this that have led to demands that urgent action be taken by the U.S. Congress to pass the Hong Kong Human Rights Act. At a Monday night rally in Hong Kong, more than 100,000 protesters shouted, "Pass the Act." Now that the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act has been passed, they are rallying for the U.S. Senate to approve it to become a law.
We hope the rally will show the United States our stand for the freedom.
If approved, the United States would impose penalties on Hong Kong and China officials who infringe upon basic freedoms in the city, including freezing their U.S.-based assets and being denied entry in the U.S. China condemns the bill and threatens to retaliate if the Hong Kong bill becomes a law. The Hong Kong government released a statement expressing its regret over the U.S. bill and warned foreign governments not to interfere in the territory's internal affairs. But pro-democracy activist Joshua Wong argues that the One Country, Two System agreement between Hong Kong and mainland China is a treaty registered with the United Nations, thus subjecting it to the scrutiny of the global community.
When one country, two system eroded to be one country, one and a half system, members of the United Nations, of course, they must have a say on Hong Kong's autonomy.
Violence has escalated in recent weeks. Widespread vandalism and destruction of properties by protesters, beatings and live round shootings by the police have led to an emergency ban of face masks, which triggered more anger among the protesters.
It's been over 100 days since the protests began, and the situation here is getting worse and it's becoming very dangerous. The question everybody is asking is how all this will end.
Will the Hong Kong government be able to hold a peaceful and fair district council election in November, allowing opposition candidates like Joshua Wong to run?
Always, Beijing say that they are willing to listen to the voice of young generation. But if our voice is not allowed to be heard in the institution, it just justifies how and why we still take to the street.
Alvin Chan is a Hong Kong reporter who has covered almost all the protests. He believes that in the midst of the social unrest in his city, God is still in control.
There's much greater power over them. This is God's love. What we should do as a Christian is keep faith and keep praying. I believe God reserve something very good in the future for us.
Lucille Toulousan, CBN News, Hong Kong.
Coming up, Andrew Brunson endured 2 years in a Turkish prison. He talks about the struggles and moments of despair until he began to believe God had a plan for it all. Well, welcome back to Christian World News. Pastor Andrew Brunson was locked up in a Turkish prison for 2 years. The plight of this imprisoned missionary attracted worldwide attention as Christians around the world were praying and working for his release. Well, that happened 1 year ago in October 2018. Now, Pastor Brunson's written a book about his ordeal called God's Hostage, a true story of persecution, imprisonment, and perseverance. I recently sat down to talk with him about that experience, but first, we talked about the chaotic situation in northern Syria. Take a look. What do you think God is doing in all this?
You know, whatever happened with those decisions, and I know many people disagree with it, I think our focus needs to be now on praying that God turn this around, because He can take terrible situations and mistakes that people make. We make mistakes. And if we pray into them and submit them to them, then He can bring something good out of it. So that's what I want right now, is not to focus so much on what already happened as to what's going to happen and how we can change that through prayer.
Well, what should we be praying specifically right now, do you think?
Well, first we would like war to stop there, the hostilities to stop, the preservation of life. But we also, what we really want to see is a move of God among these people. And what we saw with the Kurds, all of the refugees, when they, because of the civil war in Syria, many of them came into Turkey. They were much more open than other people are, than other Muslims are. And so this is driving it even more. I mean, it's even more difficult situation now that they're facing. And so we want this to lead to a breakthrough so that many, many people will turn to Jesus and ask questions that they haven't asked, that their ancestors have not asked for centuries. And so may God use us to bring many of them to himself.
I've read the book, God's Hostage. You had some really dark moments, didn't you?
I did, and I was actually, I couldn't have imagined that I would break so thoroughly and so many times, but I did. In many biographies that I had read, Christian heroes, people who are my heroes, they're so strong when they go through difficulty. And I expected that I would have a similar experience to the things I'd read about. My expectations were different. And I felt the silence of God. The silence of God in what was my darkest time. And so I was surprised at that. I expected an overwhelming sense of strength, even in difficulty, that I'd have joy, and that I'd feel grace, like a palpable sense of grace. And I did have grace, but I was mostly unaware of it. It was an unfelt grace. And so I felt at times betrayed, forgotten by God. I struggled with suicide because I thought I just want to escape the situation of despair and anxiety, fear. And what really changed in this area, I thought I don't want to die in a Turkish prison and spend the rest of my life just wasting away in isolation. But then in the second year especially, there was a turn toward saying, God, I want to complete the assignment you have for me. And so I still didn't want to live the rest of my life in a Turkish prison. I would much rather be in heaven. But I was disciplining myself and trying to focus on saying, God, if you have an assignment if this prison time is an assignment, then I need to endure. I just need to push myself forward and hold on. So then I still had thoughts of suicide, but I very much fought against it. I fought against suicide because of what I was fighting positively for, which was submission and obedience and completing the assignment God gave me.
So what do you want people to know about the persecuted church, the suffering church?
There's so many, no one knows that they're suffering. They may not have many people praying for them at all. Some of them don't have anybody praying for them because their families are against them as well. But they're famous in heaven, and God so values what they're going through. I also came to appreciate that when we are willing to suffer for Jesus, this displays to everyone who is observing, it displays his worth, that he is worthy. We're willing to sacrifice for him. And this is a very powerful testimony.
I was so impressed with Pastor Brunson. He is a man who has admitted that, look, he wasn't strong, he was weak. And his faith grew as time went on in prison. So very real. What a pleasure it was to talk to him again, and also his wife, Noreen. Thousands of Christians from every tribe and tongue came up to Jerusalem this week to celebrate the Feast of the Tabernacles. They sent a strong message. The nations stand with Israel. Emily Jones has that story and more from Jerusalem.
Welcome to Jerusalem for this Inside Israel report, where we tell you what's happening in Israel and the Middle East. Well, more than 5,000 Christian pilgrims from around the world descended upon Jerusalem this week for the International Christian Embassy's 40th annual Feast of Tabernacles celebration. The festivities began with an outside concert and continued throughout the week in the Holy City. Thousands marched to the streets of Jerusalem to worship the God of Israel and stand with his people.
There's something about Sukkot, it's a feast of joy. The Jewish people are commanded to have joy. They're also commanded to welcome the Gentiles. There's actually something in the spirit that accelerates the reconciliation between Christians and Jews during the Feast of Tabernacles that is incredible. You sense it, you feel it, that joy, and it's the joy we're tasting is from the age to come.
Organizers say Christians from more than 100 countries came for this year's celebration. For the first time in its history, Saudi Arabia is inviting Christians to come and tour historic sites in the country. The U.S.-based Christian travel company called Living Passages is hosting the tour and promises to give participants an up-close look at a controversial location believed by some Christians to be the real Mount Sinai in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's new openness to tourism comes on the heels of a historic delegation of evangelical leaders to the country earlier this year.
The Saudi Arabia of 18 years ago, the Saudi Arabia that, out of which Osama bin Laden came, Al-Qaeda, and the radical theology of violent jihad, that Saudi Arabia doesn't exist anymore. They have made sweeping changes that most Americans, most Christians aren't aware of.
The kingdom is hoping to increase international tourism with new museums, luxury hotels, and other attractions. Jews and Christians in Jerusalem are standing together in solidarity with the thousands of northeast Syrian Christians suffering from Turkey's invasion. Israelis took to the streets of Jerusalem to protest the attack and call on Turkey to end the violence.
It's a commitment, it's a Jewish commitment, not to stay silent, not to stand and just watch while something like genocide, chas v'chalila, happening.
An organization called the Jerusalemite Initiative also held a prayer vigil at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to pray for the peace of Christians, Kurds, and other civilians defending themselves against Turkey's forces. Netanyahu also said Israel is prepared to send in humanitarian aid. You can see more stories just like this week on our Jerusalem Dateline program. That's it.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you for joining us this week. Truly amazing times we're living in. We're privileged to bring these stories to you. Until next week, goodbye, and God bless you.